Hello and greetings and salutations, fellow denizens of comics YouTube. Welcome to For the Love of Comics. This is another Sunday live stream. Glad to see people already in the chat. So, greetings to everyone joining us live, as well as greetings to those watching a recording of this later. This is an sort of impromptu live stream. I did discuss this a little bit in the, hold on, I've got audio coming through on the other side. 1 second. There we go. Every single time I always have this. Hello, hello. Great to see so many people here already. We've got that boy Joshua. We've got Davarai. Ashwita is in the chat moderating. Sleepy Reader, good to see you here. K-Bar, Ritwik, glad you could join us. So welcome everyone. Glad to have everyone over here. I'll chat a little bit about how this live stream came to be just while we wait for a couple of people to join the comic binge. Great to see you here. Yay, live stream. Sleepy Reader says that he hasn't read classics illustrated since he was a kid. They were a second choice after superhero comics. Second, we'll talk about this because that is the topic of today's live stream. We're going to be talking about classics illustrated. And what I mean by classics illustrated, of course, I will get into a little bit of detail before we dive in. But the way that this live stream came to be is I was planning to make an edited video. I have a video that I've been working on for a long time. When I say working on, I've been lying in bed thinking about having to make this video. It's a video that I've wanted to make since it's a spotlight on one of my favorite creators. There was a poll, people voted. I just haven't been able to get to it, and this week was incredibly busy. But rather than have no upload at all, I've had a couple of ideas about live streams I want to do, and things have been on my mind. So I put up a poll, asked people what they would like to see in a live stream, and choose between classics illustrated, are they any good, or a sort of meandering look through my videos over the last 5 years or so, you know, celebrating a sort of anniversary and milestones and being on YouTube, something laid back that I thought I could do quite easily. Of course, everyone, well, not everyone, it was a close race in some, and I did have some weird choices to allow myself some exits, but the votes turned out in favor of Classics Illustrated, which meant that in less than 24 hours, I had to do some homework. I figured I don't need to do homework. That's what the live chat is for. So if you're watching this later, I would strongly recommend you turn on live chat. And at the, don't select top chat because that censors what it thinks is spam. This is a very tiny channel. There is barely any spam. Instead, select all. So select live chat instead of top chat to see all the comments. And there's gold in there. And I'm hoping that some gold will come through today as well. As we talk about the comics that we're going to talk about, I'm fully expecting people to chime in with their own stories, their own experiences, their own knowledge or lack thereof as far as these are concerned. But I also know that people are very fast on Google while these live streams are going on. There are other tabs open. And people are very often looking things up and getting dates and titles and creators, plucking them out and making them part of the live stream, which I really enjoy. I can't always get to the comments, but I really enjoy looking through them later or whenever I get the chance. And I know that people in the live chat also have a lot of fun in these conversations. However, if you do not wish to participate in the live chat and just want to watch, that's fine as well. We've got a number of different things to talk about today, and it will be no surprise to regulars, a bit of a meandering chat, but just hello, good evening, good day, good morning, wherever you are. Glad to see people in the chat, just catching up on comments, everyone just saying hi. Great to see everyone. All right. Oh, we've got Weird Pro Q saying I've never heard of these. That's very interesting because I think that's a good place to start. So a little bit of context. Well, let's spread the context. I almost cheated. I still, even though the poll came out in favor of Classics Illustrated, I almost did the other live stream. And that's because I couldn't find one particular comic that I really wanted to talk about and I really wanted to show. And it was kind of important. Maybe it's not. You'll find out soon enough. But because I couldn't find it, I almost put this off. I almost decided to do the other one. And I was just like, I don't need to do homework for that. I am the homework. So Ashwita, my wife, who is in the chat right now, came to the rescue in spectacular fashion. She looked at a video, a shelf video, in which she got to see what the book looked like and what the spine looked like. And she went to a particular shelf because we've moved since that video was made, and she found it. So all thanks to Ashwita, this live stream is indeed about Classics Illustrated, because she found that one little linchpin of a comic that I wanted. Maybe I was just trying to make an excuse for not doing this live stream, because it is a little intimidating. So the first thing I will say is, by no means am I an authority, or am I presenting this video as any sort of authoritative talk about Classics Illustrated, because this is a long-running, very famous series, and at the same time, it has kind of, shall we say, a mixed reputation, where the reputation exists at all. So I'm not an authority. This is really my personal experience with Classics Illustrated, and I want to take, as usual on this channel, I want to take an autobiographical approach. I want to talk about my readings of these Classics Illustrated, what I thought of them, what I thought of them before I read them, while I read them, when I read them. There's a whole bunch of stuff over here that I have no script for, no outlines, no cards. I just have a bunch of comics over here that I'm just going to talk over. So let me just check to make sure, is my audio and my video, is all of that coming through all right? Is it too loud? Is it too soft? Can you hear me on left and right channels? These are things I've usually had problems with before. Oh, I don't think I've turned on. I think I've turned on all my lights, but I think I'm missing one. Hold on. All right, a little bit of a technical thing. All right. That's it. That was it. That was the last touch. Those of you who attended my self-destructing live stream in setting up lights, this is the last light that we added over there, something for differentiating you from the background. Anyway, this is not a technical live stream. This is going to be about comics, but I do have a couple more technical tests to run. So if you'll bear with me, is my second camera working? Yes, it is. Does that look a little overexposed to people? Could probably try to mess with that camera. I do think that's a little overexposed. What does everyone think? Weirdproc says, looks good to me. Sounds and looks great. Good, good, good. All of these things. Always ask the viewers if the audio is all right. Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to make sure. I think this is a little overexposed. I'm not really sure what I'll be able to do about it at this point. Let's see. No. 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 Yes. I think that's much better. What does everyone think? 800 ISO. Do I have a diffuser for the light? Well, this particular one that I'm putting over the comics is a little too direct. I can't put a diffuser in front of that light because it interferes with the camera and the lens. I'll probably have to find like a bounce solution or something like that, but it's such a limited space here on my desk. You know, it's just this stuff in front of me, and then I have a few too many gadgets and peripherals and connections. But I think this should be all right. Ashwita says, good, right, way better, very good now, thank you. Great, good to know. And I'm going to try another thing in this live stream. So is the picture-in-picture working? Yes, I think it is. So what do you know? I think we're good to go. And there's a reason why that picture-in-picture exists, although I don't know how much I'm actually going to use it. So Welcome to For the Love of Comics Sunday live stream, in which we're going to talk about Classics Illustrated. And for all the researchers and scholars out there, be ready because, as I said, I'm not going to be authoritative, but you can supplement what I'm saying and what my experience has been with the facts as well as yours. So, Classics Illustrated is a series that I think the title, perhaps like Xerox or things like that, has become more commonly used than just the brand name or just the actual title. Because when I was growing up, a number of things were called Classics Illustrated. And they were comic books, they were illustrated, abridged, young readers versions, there were all kinds of things that combined illustration with text and usually were abridged adaptations of literary classics, 18th, 19th century literature, sometimes older, things that are, hallowed and held in high esteem over many, many years. Not necessarily academic stuff, although they may have the reputation of being academic. I think they're a little more old fashioned. But anyway, that's not the point. The point it was Robinson Crusoe and well, let's just look what we have over here. The Three Musketeers, Jane Eyre. But there were also Arabian Nights. There were all kinds of things that classified. But my point is that I read a number of books, and now some of them might have been called illustrated classics and variations of that. But classics and illustrated have been combined in various ways, and I think around the world in different ways to accommodate a number of different things. It's sort of like a Golden Dragon being the name of a Chinese restaurant. You're going to run into more than one of those out there. So Classics Illustrated, the brand name, was actually a series of comics started in the United States in 1941. So way back when, with an idea of introducing kids who were really into comic books, but not so much into real reading, into good reading, into reading the classics in literature, introducing them to the classics through these abridged comic book versions. This is slightly different from the illustrated abridged versions that always, I think, existed for children, or immediately soon after the original publication, you would have had variations and versions for children, which were simplified, boiled down, and then they would have illustrations. A lot of these were presented as adventure stories, particularly appealing to kids. Now, of course, a lot of things were removed and censored or made more appropriate for children in all of these versions. And Classics Illustrated was no exception. But 1941 is when Classics Illustrated started being published in the US. And in some form or the other, the Classics Illustrated line has been around since then. It's been dormant as far as new publications are concerned for considerable stretches of time, but there have always been reprints and there have always been licensing deals. And this is particularly important to people like me, people who live in India, people who live in other countries outside of the United States. You may get to read, or you may have gotten to read these comics at various points of times as imports, as that actual US product that was created in the United States. But the chances are quite high that you read a localized reprint, something that was licensed for publication in either your country or your region. This may be done for price reasons, logistics, for a number of different reasons. And of course, there are translations, but I'm speaking still about the English language reprint. So without a translation, the text as it appeared in the United States, the art as it appeared, we'll see about that, in the US version, but produced locally for a local market. I'm just checking the comments to see if there was, Sleepy Reader says, have read that Classics Illustrated was some of the best-selling individual issues in the traditional US market because they could stay in print longer, and it was because that's what parents would choose. Yes, absolutely. They were incredibly successful from what I've researched and found out online. They were very popular from the very get-go. Probably, I mean, absolutely helped by the idea that parents felt these were good books. If you're going to buy your kids comics, these are the comics you should be buying them. You know, they get to learn about literature, they get to learn about the classics. So yes, very successful. And I believe that they actually started with this one, The Three Musketeers. This says over here, number 10. This is an Indian reprint, and this is a more recent reprint, and we'll talk specifically about this reprint later. But this is, I believe, the first Classics Illustrated published in 1941. And that is the thing that I have over here on PDF, because I had to look up certain things. I wanted to find them online, and there's a reason why, because I wanted to do a comparison. And of course, I don't have anything outside of this. So I have gone to maybe it's a suspect site. Do let me know if it's not appropriate, but I think it's fair use because we're doing a comparison and these are legally purchased copies. But anyway, that's not a legal argument. My point is that I do want to have something to compare these against. So I've got some online webs. They're not even PDFs, so nothing's downloaded on my computer. It's just something that I would like to compare these comics to. But here you have The Three Musketeers. Here is Robinson Crusoe, Jane Eyre, Arabian Nights, The Adventures of Marco Polo, David Copperfield, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. All of these are modern, recent Indian reprints, and they're copies, essentially they're local reprints, but of the American material, the American comics that were published in the 1940s and 50s, and throughout as well. But these are early issues, and if you look up the history, you'll see it's quite interesting to me, first and foremost, that these comics are still being published today. These are, as I'm saying, these are recent printings. They're still being published today and distributed over the world by licensing. So it definitely carries the Classics Illustrated branding. And these stories, as far as I've been able to tell, with the comparisons that I have over here, are exactly those, page for page. So that's the first level of interest, where these Classics Illustrated, and this is just a small sampling. There are, I think, more than 200 of them, if I'm not mistaken. They're all, I'm not sure if they're all reprinted, but if you go online and look for the Classics Illustrated, you'll find almost a dizzying array. Now, some of them are from the 40s, some from the 50s, some from the 60s, because they did publish continuously until the 1970s. So this is very, it's a huge list, and all your usual suspects will be there. You've got the stories of Jules Verne, you've got the stories of H.G. Wells, you've got Jane Austen, you've got George Eliot, you've definitely got Charles Dickens, often 2-3 books by the same author, the famous ones that you would expect. Edward says that he's pretty sure that his dad has one or two of these books. Yes, it's quite possible. But the thing is that I don't have, and I'm sure that the original printings, and they were massively reprinted. They were reprinted over and over again because, as Sleepy Reader said, they just stayed in print. They were very popular, and being out of copyright works that are being adapted by authors and artists who are essentially working for hire, you've got this material that is sort of evergreen. Classics, there's a reason why they're called that. It's evergreen, and so it kind of stands the test of time, and you keep printing more, and your old readers who bought your previous volumes will be buying these, and you don't have any worry about continuity, and now I missed some issues in between. Everything is a standalone classic story, and you'll constantly find new readers buying your old volumes. So number 1 and number 25 really doesn't matter for comics like this. Vincent O'Neill, yes, Love and Rockets t-shirt, thank you. I got this off of Fantagraphics' website. It's one of my favorite covers. Number 31, is it? Now, of course, I'm going to not remember at this point of time. Yeah, it's a great red and black cover. The only thing is I I guess it could have been cool in red as well, but I'm sure there are technical reasons. But yes, thank you. Official Love and Rockets t-shirt. So as I was saying about these comics, these are all new reprints, and I picked them up because I wanted to get a sense of the classic comics, and this is the only way that I could physically. I also wanted to see if there were any differences between these and those scans that I found online. And I think, I've got this pulled up over here, so this is a good one to start with the Three Musketeers. If we take a look at this book, pardon the bump in the microphone, maybe. If we take a look at this book, ooh, I wonder if I could get closer. No. No. Give me just 1 second. So you can see that the drawings are, I mean, they don't look great. If you look at the figures, there's definitely, they're recognizable shapes. It's not incomprehensible. But honestly speaking, there's an interesting selection. You do have a close-up, you've got wider shots, but it seems a little bit more standard. And the line work and the colors, there just seems to be something off about them. I was really wondering that this has to do with the reprint. I'm sure maybe the colors are oversaturated, or they're a limited palette wherever they are printing these. Now, I will say that I'm not trying to diss the publishers or anything. I'm just trying to do a comparison, because if you look at this price, it says 40 rupees. So that's literally 50 cents in today's exchange. If we look at that, the original 1941 edition, the price over there is 15 cents in 1941. Now, of course, exchange rates are different, and it's not a fair comparison. But still, this is an extremely low price edition made solely for the affordability of it. Is to get a classic story in a classic form. Now, obviously, even a comic from 1941 is a classic form, into the hands of people who may not otherwise be able to read the story. And from that point of view, and from that point of justification, as far as all of this is concerned, it's hard to fault wanting exposure and wanting to find a view, wanting to find a way of getting that exposure. But the art and the coloring did bother me when I looked at this. Very often, when I looked at the faces and I looked at them close, they didn't seem very well drawn. But it isn't about the number of lines or the level of detail. It was more about how it felt like they'd somehow been traced in. So I developed this theory that maybe the printing or the replication or the files that they have somehow aren't in very good shape, and someone is filling these in. Now, I have no idea if that's the case or not, but I've definitely seen low price editions. I've definitely seen locally produced and manufactured editions, not just from India, but from other places in the world, which seem to have printing problems in which people's faces and body figure shapes seem to have been drawn over or connected, usually by someone who isn't the original artist. But I don't know if this is the case in this text, and that's why I did want to take a look at Three Musketeers in its original form. So we'll just go over to the PDF over there. And the first thing that I think we can see, I can do the picture in picture. So the first thing that I can see is that it's definitely more saturated, even with the difference in the yellowness of the paper and the age of it. I think even accommodating for that yellowness, these reds and these yellows over here seem very, very stark. And the thing that I wanted to look at, the figure that bothered me over here so much, over here, definitely has more detail. If I switch back to if I switch back to this, now let me see if I can pull focus on this. If I bring this up, give me just a second. All right, and now there we go. So if you look at the detail on that face right here, there's definitely something missing from the original. So whether it is a printing issue or whether it is a question of files, etc., I'm not really sure, but it definitely suffers in the transition to this edition. The paper quality actually isn't bad at all. The cover is quite thick and glossy. It's just the interior pages which has this gap. And honestly speaking, I know it's old, but this art, it has an old-fashioned charm to it, but it doesn't look extremely skilled. And for that, let's take a look at this one panel over here, which stood out to me because it's a moment from the Three Musketeers that I quite admire. Let me see if I can zoom in properly. So this bottom left panel over here, this is when D'Artagnan's running out and he bumps, well, I think this is the largest I can get it, but and he bumps into, and you've got him being caught in this person's, well, I mean, in the Musketeer's cloak. Over here, I'm not really very clear of what's going on, and I have trouble even over here discerning the size of these figures next to each other. This is with the original colors, and of course the original colors were also on a severely limited palette, so they're trying to do their best with the contrasts over here. But the fact that he's running into his billowing cloak, even though he's in purple and he's in red, is extremely it's confusing to me. I know what's going on over here, and at the same time I am unable to see it, which is unfortunate. That's also the case in the reprint. Even with the starkness, this is, I think, a little worse because the already limited color palette has been made even more limited. So essentially all I'm seeing over here is greens and red. There's the yellow over there, but this is even more indecipherable. Oh, I knew I would have another focus problem. Sorry about this, because I'm on manual focus. This is for some people who haven't attended one of these live streams before. Because I'm on manual focus and I don't want all of that stuff from the camera to show up, I have to keep adjusting it when I move the books back and forth. But yes, this action over here is very, very muddy, is very blotched. So it isn't just a question of the level of detail lost in these figures and the rather garish color reproduction. Even in the original, I think there are certain things that just would not be to our modern tastes, maybe. But I think this is more than that, because here, okay, so here we go. Here's another, this is probably the one I was thinking of. Here is where he runs into the cloak in this top right panel. And D'Artagnan running into his cloak makes D'Artagnan look like either a very short man, stunted, or a little boy. The proportions over here, he's supposed to be moving towards us. I mean, I know this seems like a lot to criticize, but it interferes with understanding what's happening in the story. And if you know the story of the Three Musketeers, well, then it's anyway a little removed from our notions. What is an insult? It's kind of like trying to understand chivalry or other codes of another time in a royal area. And it's hard enough to understand what's a slight, what's an offense, why are these musketeers challenging him to a duel, what are they so bothered about, without having the presentation of what's going on get this muddled. So this unfortunately seems to be the case for all of these stories. Now, granted, all of these versions that I'm looking at, these modern reprints, do have these off colors and do have lines, as we can see, that are either being erased or being simplified, being copied over, or being replicated in a way that doesn't preserve the original. But even the original, it seems like the skill in putting this comic together seems to have gone into the intent. Now, there is an exception. You may ask, what about the writing? And to a certain extent, well, these are classics of literature. You would expect that the writing would be good. Now, anytime you take any book and make it this slim, and that too in pictures, if this was this slim in prose, it would be a severe abridgment. When you create scenes and moments out of that work in this way, even with narration, there's a lot you're cutting out. So when I talk about writing, I don't mean in comparison to the original story. There can never be a comparison to the original story. What you would want, though, in an adaptation, even one for young readers, even one for children, what you would want is to capture the essence of the story. And I think in most cases, the stories themselves are so good that their essence comes through, the essence of adventure, the essence of horror. But a lot of the more adult, a lot of the more complex issues that these works of literature may be about or could be understood to have commentary on is simply going to be lost. There's no way to really preserve that while trying to keep dialogue and narration adapted from the book. The book has a lot more room to allow that dialogue and narration to provide the context that this would either need to summarize or would need to forego altogether. And I think that's one of the problems with adaptation. That's one of the problems with any kind of abridgment, is there will be things that you will have to cut out. There will be things that you will have to sacrifice. In some cases, there may be things that you add. And when we get into movies and how they're made and why they're made a particular way, it becomes more complicated. But in looking at comics versions of literary classics, I have to confess that I was always very snooty about it. I didn't think that those were a good idea at all. Very absolutist. And I'm talking over here in my teenage years, or even in my 20s, when I came back to reading comics. I had a very snotty attitude to say that literature is literature, comics is comics. Comics should make its own literature. It shouldn't be trying to adapt. And much of that snottiness, I think, came from not necessarily these stories, although I believe that some of these old American classics illustrated were comics that I had read somewhere in my childhood, not in these editions, but similar editions, reprints. And this reprint issue of the colors being off or the drawings being off, they affected a lot of local reprints as well. So in locally produced comics in India, I also developed a distinction between those reprints that did a very good job and those reprints that seemed to be a little off, where even without looking at the original, I could feel like there wasn't something quite right. And the classics illustrated that I first encountered, perhaps in my childhood, may have been things like this, or variations on this. Eat your vegetables and give the kids something good, and this is a way to get them into real reading. This is a bridge for what is really worthwhile. Comics aren't worthwhile, but maybe they can be used. Maybe they can be used to manipulate children into doing something worthwhile. So those were all part of my thought process in rejecting the possibility that these could ever be any good. And honestly speaking, if I look at these and go back over these and read them with an eye to ignoring the color and ignoring the problems with the art, which are extremely hard to ignore, by the way, the writing isn't bad, but I recognize a lot of the writing from the books, and it just seems like snippets and cut pieces, and it seems like a shame because you don't have what else is there. But I would say that if I was to think about these comics over here, Jane Eyre and not David Copperfield. I think it's Robinson Crusoe. These they're well written from the point of view of adaptation, and the art in the Arabian Nights is actually not bad. As you can tell from the cover, it's quite interesting. It feels obviously it's older, but it feels like the kind of things that Charles Vess and P. Craig Russell would bring, the sort of classic illustration. This seems to be one of those things. But again, the internal art is marred by that printing and that color problem. But you can see glimmers of this being something quite different and quite interesting. But again, I would love to see the original of this. And I think that all of these can be found not so legally online, but these seem to be hard to find in the US unless there are new reprints of this. I think there are new reprints of this in India. There are new reprints of these old stories across the world, but I don't know if these are being reprinted in the US at all. But it would be interesting to see these stories because you can see in particular issues, even with drawing like that, that's been really badly affected, I think, in the reprint process. You can see that there were certain pieces, at least, that had things that looked somewhat interesting and good, along with a decent selection of what to take in heavy abridgment. So decent enough writing. It's okay, but really not my cup of tea. I wouldn't want to give these to a kid. And so therefore I would say, no, you don't need to read classics in this way. Just read the real classics when you get old enough, and read things that are written for children, or read things that are suitable for children as children. But that's my thought process as it was at a particular point of time. Of course, that does have some changes. I'm going to pause here to take a look at comments. Right, people are noting that there is a lot of crude comics art in the early days of comics, and we're talking about this. This is pretty early. They had different limitations. Sure, they cheaped out. They didn't necessarily hire the most skilled artists, and I think this is the interesting thing. I think perhaps, and I've got no way of proving this, but perhaps the idea was get a good writer or get someone who knows the classics and get them to create the script. And the illustration is just all based on that. I don't think in these stories, from what I've seen, there is a real in-depth understanding of how the comics medium works. I mean, there is a good understanding, but I think a lot of that is just coming from replicating what other comics are doing. Now, when you think about artists like Hal Foster or Alex Raymond later, and what they're able to do with situations and stories like this, there's a lot that the visuals bring to that, the epic nature of fantasy or adventure, danger, horror. It seems obvious to us, but it doesn't seem that obvious over here in these early days. When I have David Copperfield and I have Jane Eyre, they're illustrated in a way that's almost interchangeable. There isn't really any cinematography, there isn't really any music that is being created in these comics that's specific to these stories. And I think that is what I also carried with me as an impression. Alongside that, I did have another thought process as well, but let me just quickly check because there seem to be some great comments over here and I've missed everything. Yes, the website has been identified. Had old Shakespeare graphic adaptations and classics illustrated because the art is quite similar. That might be. I think there's so many of these that works of Shakespeare, as I was saying earlier, works of authors. There are multiple works by the same authors. So I think that there were, let's get all of Shakespeare in here. Let's get all of Dickens in here. Let's get all of Jane Austen in here. So there's also Brothers Grimm and fairy tales. So what one means by classics really gets more and more nebulous. You're not talking only about British literature. You're not talking only about American literature. In most cases, you are, but still, you've got variation and you've got things from over the years. You've got Mark Twain alongside Jules Verne. So I'm not sure about the approach, but I'm thinking that it was a purely financial one where it's like, this is, and it paid off. I mean, since they were so successful, it was like, here's a need in the market that we're going to create. And this whole thing about giving kids what's good for them was the selling point. It was the whole idea, is that here is a thing, here are comics. Now, I'm sure that there were some kids who didn't want to read these comics, but I'm also sure there were many kids who really enjoyed them, because at the essence, they are great stories. They are, if you read The Count of Monte Cristo, that's a thrilling revenge thriller, and it's absolutely madcap. So it's entertaining, exciting stuff. But, and here is the here is the second thought process that I had, is that it's not true, I felt, that these get you to appreciate great literature. In fact, I felt it was the opposite. They reduced great literature to where once you had read this, you believed you had read The Three Musketeers. Once you had read Robinson Crusoe like this, or something similar, you believed you had read Robinson Crusoe. And that's the same for Gulliver's Travels. Now, when I was much older, although not 18 or 19, but maybe when I was 13 or so, a relative gave my sister and I a volume of Gulliver's Travels, which was called The Complete Travels of Gulliver. And it was this thick, and it was beautiful. It was hardbound, and it had lovely cover illustrations, but it wasn't illustrated. And it was the original text, and there were so many stories in there. There was Lilliput and Brobdingnag, and then there were more voyages. So all of them collected in there, and it sort of blew my mind, because I had no idea, first of all, about the anything outside of the two voyages, and I also had no idea that there was so much detail in the story. So when I read that, I don't know if I got all of Jonathan Swift's satire. I think some things were a little over my head, but there were certain things that I definitely got. I really got this idea that there were these two kingdoms, and they were fighting over whether they should wear high heels or flat heels, or whether they should crack open the egg on this side. It seemed very obvious, even to my young mind, that this was a sort of commentary on governments and kings and rulers and why people go to war and what's the difference between people. And it blew my mind, because the Gulliver's Travels that I had read was him putting out a fire and helping these guys defeat their enemies. Why they were fighting was such an important part of that full text. And if it wasn't for that book, and then later in college, I had to read Robinson Crusoe, and I was like, why are they making me read a kid's book? And I read Robinson Crusoe, and it was all about economics and accounting, and that's what the class was about. But again, it blew my mind. And if it hadn't been for that accidental reading of classics, because I studied stuff in college, I would have continued for my whole life thinking that I knew these stories, that I had read these stories. So I didn't feel that by having read anything, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that I was tempted to go and read the real Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I thought I had gotten the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde the way that people might think they got that from a movie. And back in the day, that really irritated me, as in, maybe I was precocious, but by the time I was in college, I was definitely irritated by the fact that I had been lied to, that I had been told these were the stories, and these weren't actually the stories. The real stories were darker and more complex. Many of these stories had things in them about race and women that were very interesting, because they are pieces of literature, because they're written with such detail and they're written with such observation that when they think about things as normal, it can stand the test of time, and we can read it today and saying this is what they thought was normal, or this is how it gives us a real insight into those things. And I thought, now I was getting to that thought process that adapting that and removing those things was just absolutely criminal. So that's my enlightened, extremely antagonistic towards adaptations, comics attitude. And I felt very justified in having that attitude. But, but, I wouldn't be actually telling the truth, is what I figured out. And the reason I wouldn't actually be telling the truth is a lot of my love for reading and a lot of my love for stories came from comics because I read comics when I was young, and came from prose because I read prose when I was young, and came from illustrated books because I read illustrated books when I was young. It all combined together, the pleasure of reading and wanting to read good stories. And while it may be true that some of these stories I assumed I knew because I'd read them in comics form, I read them in abridged form, illustrated classics, the prose on one side and an illustration on the other. So you had one image per page and it was large font, small digest size. Those books, I remember them fondly. I remember loving them. And then I also remembered these books that I read, and these are actually my childhood copies. So these are not new reprints like those other ones that I picked up for research purposes. And I had many more of them. I had Black Beauty, I had Dracula. I don't know where they've gone. They've been lost to the sands of time. The mutiny on board the HMS Bounty, I thought I had lost. But once again, Ashwita came to the rescue and found this. The Three Musketeers and Kidnapped. So these are from my childhood. Now, the interesting thing is, interesting to me anyway, is that these say Classics Illustrated over here. And inside, I have a... Oh, Comics Dude, thank you so much for the super chat. Thank you, I really appreciate it. When am I going to show you my Love and Rockets 40th anniversary collection and review it? Well, how do you know I have it? Well, I do have it. But it's in the United States, so it'll be a while before I can get to it. But I do have to make a Love and Rockets video or two. It's been hanging over my head. But anyway, so the Three Musketeers to the teacher. So it's obviously to... it's meant for educational purposes, etc. But what I was saying was, inside over here, it says that this is printed in Hungary for the publishers at Peter Haddock Limited, 1981, Pendulum Press, USA. All rights reserved. So far, so good. But underneath that, it says authorized for sale in the UK and Africa only. And this is something that I picked up in India, which is neither the UK nor Africa. So... But the interesting thing is, it says Pendulum Press, licensed from Pendulum Press. So this is licensed from the United States. This is a United States publication originally, but this is also a reprint. This is a reprint from 1981 that was only for sale in the UK and somehow UK and Africa, and somehow made its way over to India. A lot of these did. And as I said, I had a lot of these as well. Now, Pendulum Press, in my research, did not publish Classics Illustrated. They got the idea from Classics Illustrated, but in the 70s, the Pendulum Press in the US published something called New Age Classics. And this little circle over here, that over here says Classics Illustrated, says New Age Classics in the US editions. And interestingly, and this is something, I love these books. I loved all the books that I read. And I love them because the stories were good, but these were good comics. That's what I felt. Unlike those other ones that I've showed earlier and that I have talked about, this art to me, when I was young, was spectacular. It is in black and white. I don't know if the original Pendulum Press was color, but even if it is, I never want to see it in color. This is beautiful black and white art alongside newspaper comics that looked like, let's say, Modesty Blaze or Garth. They looked adult. They looked grown up. They didn't look like Peanuts and Garfield and the other comics that were more funny. And this seemed to me, with its realistic depiction and its use of blacks and shadows and outlining, I mean, as a kid, this was fascinating. When talking about Kidnapped, the boat, oh yes, Moby Dick, I had another word, the boats in it, the swords in it, the hats, the uniforms, the coats, the furniture. Long before I was watching period dramas in movie or television form, this is what gave me that insight of which made that world come alive. The writing is fine. The lettering is okay. In fact, I would say some of this writing is a little too modernized. It seems a little too like some of these classics. As much as it was clunky, they were taking original lines, I think, more often, and they weren't feeling the need to rewrite them. I mean, they were rewriting them, but they were leaving more out and putting words in to make it flow better. But it is like the original text and gets its value from that. The text over here is rather simplified. It's more modernized, but it was the art. It was the layouts, the fact that some panels were longer, some panels went vertical, some panels went horizontal, some panels were square, some were small. These are things that became sophisticated comics for me. And this is definitely one of those things that as a child I had as building blocks. Now, no matter what my future snobbery of not knowing the real story of Kidnapped or the Three Musketeers until I read them later, it doesn't matter, because these Three Musketeers, the capes that they have, that their hats that they have, these are indelibly sketched into my mind. And artist over here, Alex Nino. Kidnapped. The artist on Kidnapped is Frank Redondo. These are the artists of what was called the Filipino invasion, where Stan Lee got a bunch of artists from the Philippines to come in and do art for American comics because they were cheaper. And Stan Lee was apparently friends, or Timely Comics was where the publisher of Pendulum Press, the Pendulum Press professor, and Stan Lee had worked together over there. And so Stan Lee got him the contacts. This is Ruby Flores. The HMS Bounty art is also very good. But you've got Alfredo Alcala. You've got comics by him. And this is something I discovered many, many years later, that these are artists who have worked in superhero comics. And I think even till today, I don't think I've read any superhero comics by Nino or by Alcala or by Redondo. I have read these classics illustrated. The art in this, for me as a child, was so phenomenally altering as what comics art can be, because I was reading so many of these things that were simpler. They were great, they were very entertaining, but this seemed real. This seemed like a full costume drama. As I said before, I'd seen costume dramas. It seemed like a big budget movie before I'd seen big budget movies. The battles over here. Now, there are battles in asterisks, and those are great battles, but these are great battles as well. There are bottles of rum over here that to me are as iconic as the bottles of rum in Tintin. The sausages and things that hang from the larder, the meats. Oh my goodness. As a child, I had never seen art like this. There was Asterix, and I have said on many occasions that Asterix has great, great food in it, but the furniture, the clothes, the way that this world looked, this is why I think I'm actually wrong about my snobbery, is that these did get me into reading. They did make me appreciate things, even though I wasn't able to put vocabulary around it until much, much later. I realized that in my childhood, when I was developing that taste of what I like and what I don't like, what is appealing to me, there is a period of time, I think, where you're just absolutely omnivorous. It doesn't matter what's put in front of you, you'll read it. So it wasn't like I refused to read anything. Everything gets read. Everything gets read twice or thrice, but certain things get read 100 times. There's a difference between the things that you read 4 times, because that's normal, and the things that you read over and over and over again. These comics were ones that I read over and over again. I'm quite surprised that they're still holding together. They're not actually. The pages are coming out. But I would love to find more. I don't know. The way these things go is that they're probably very rare or valuable because they're collector's items or things like that. I don't care. I wish that they were reprinted, because I want to see this art and I want to see these stories and I want to see everything, because I think the New Age classics also had a number of books. I don't think they had anywhere near the Classics Illustrated, but I love these. And these were what I thought Classics Illustrated were, because they say Classics Illustrated. They didn't say that in the US, they said it outside the US. But this is what I first encountered. Those are stories that I kind of maybe encountered. But whenever I looked for Classics Illustrated and I found other things, I couldn't understand it. I was like, where's the Redondo art? Where is the Nino art? That's what I'm looking for. Who knew? So Pendulum Press, New Age Classics, is the comic series that I thought of when I thought of Classics Illustrated, the comic series. I was wrong, kind of, but at least I know where they are as far as the original American source is concerned. And I'd love to see these be reprinted. Purely for the nostalgia. As I said, the writing isn't that great, but the way the story moves and the way it's dictated by the art, the way it's represented by the art, is still something, maybe purely for nostalgia, but still something that I really, really enjoy. And I would love to have that collection one day. Rajat Sen says Anandamela used to publish comics adaptations of classics in their festive volumes. The art was black and white and was quite good. Yeah, I'd be interested. Do you know if it was original art commissioned in India or was it reprints? Because I think it may well have been reprints of this, because this black and white, as I was saying, works really well in newspapers and in magazines that are single color because of that contrast and this. What is called the negative space, the chiaroscuro aspect of it. It works so well that I can see it being much more than color comics being badly filled in. I can see it being the thing that you do reprints of, because low price reprints of, because you don't spend that much in color and it looks absolutely stunning. I mean, I'm not saying it's perfect printing. There's a lot that my adult critical eye can find, but no, that's easy to get over. This is stuff that would be, I wouldn't be surprised if it was this. Sham says, Devo Protim Sham says, I'm a 90s kid and grew up with some of those, but have lost these books now. Brings back memories. Which ones? Are you talking about these ones, the New Age ones? Because yeah, these ones, I know that these are what memories are made of. The other ones, although, who's to tell? This is one of those things, is that maybe if I'd read the other ones when I was an omnivorous reader, maybe if I got all my stories from there, I would have that kind of association with that. But, it's not true, because I remember other things I read when I was a kid. I remember reading good comics and comics that I did not think were that good. And that continued in my life, even though I didn't have, as I was saying, the vocabulary for it. I was able to discern what I classified as good comics and not. And somehow it seems that whenever I go hunting, I find some reason for it. There are certain things that are pure nostalgia. But yeah, I think it's interesting, because I don't think something can be pure nostalgia, because if you loved it that much, it kind of changed who you were. It kind of determined what you like. So who you like is because of that love. So you're not appreciating it because it's old. You're appreciating it because you still think that, because somewhere it became part of your DNA. At least that's, like my hodgepodge approach to that. Timely became Atlas in the 50s, and then in the 60s it became Marvel, right? So Timely is, I think, where the publisher of Pendulum Press and Stan Lee worked together. Vince Fago replaced Stan Lee as Timely editor when he was in the army, right? And Fago was no longer there by circa 1950. Eric Kota says you've unlocked a load of memories. Yeah, this is the way I feel. I mean, can you imagine that if I found Moby Dick, that would be it. I would be like, all right, everyone, thank you very much for the live stream, but I'm going to take a look at this because I haven't seen it in years. So there's definitely the nostalgia aspect of it. But honestly, I think even without the rose tinted goggles, today when I look at this art, I'm not looking at the lettering, I'm not looking at the writing. When I look at this art and when I see the way it goes across the page, I remember the story. It evokes everything very, very clearly to me. And speaking of clear evocation, let's do a full circle before we close up on of this. That we have a scene where D'Artagnan, we saw the scene in the other comic. We have the same thing over here. There's D'Artagnan. He walks into the cloak. So, yeah, I don't think there's any comparison. It's so clear, and I'm trying to see if this is the page that I was on when I was comparing that. So if you look at the top right of that page, the top right panel is representing the same thing that this bottom right panel is representing. And D'Artagnan is obviously so much closer to you. I think it's Aramis. I can't remember who it was whose cape was flying, but he's slightly behind, so he's just a slight bit bigger. The proportions, the distances, they all seem right. And I could maybe, take an adult view of this. I'm not an artist, as I keep saying, so I wouldn't actually be able to express that. But it looks right. It looks right to me in a way that care has been taken, not just with the barrels and the sausages, but everything, all of the fabric, all of the clothing, and the fact that the action is so clear that I understand what has happened so clearly over here. That's my reason why it still holds up. Is I look at it today and it's clear to me today. I remember this story, sure, because of nostalgia, but also when I look at it here, I can see the shapes just made elegantly. And that is what I think these comics did for me, is that they taught me to appreciate comics, to say just because it's a comic on the Three Musketeers doesn't mean it's the same comic. It doesn't look like those other comics. And there's a reason why this comic is a better read to you. There's a reason why you're reading this over and over again and you're poring over these pages. And maybe it'll take you a couple of decades to find the words for those reasons, but it's there, which is what I really love about it. So my snobbery actually is very misplaced. I think it comes from a place based on a certain kind of experience, and there's certainly something to be said about the way that it works and the way that I'm not saying that the Baudelarization of literature, the censorship of it, or the adaptation of it to make it for children is a good thing. And I think I still agree that that isn't something I really enjoy, but transforming it to another medium. Yes, these are for children. And if they weren't, I can just imagine how good they would be because of the artists, the people working on it, the people adapting it. So when you're adapting it to another medium, it's not about the original. I mean, it is in the way that you want to be faithful and the things that people say, you want to preserve the truth, but you are adapting it. And that's the reason you picked it up. So that job of adaptation, I think, has to be central in determining whether something is good or not, and if you do it only for the money and you do it only because you think there's a market segment and you can do this at a lower cost, etc., you'll make money, you'll be popular, sure, but it's not going to have that same effect that if, and there's no reason to think that, oh, these people who were publishing this were any more artistically inclined or any more altruistically leaning towards bettering the comics medium. They wanted to make money as well, sure. And the whole idea of the artists of the Filipino invasion also has to do with, like, where can we get work cheap? Where can we get so in many ways they're quite similar, but sometimes in spite of something or within that parameter, within that framework, you can still end up with great stuff. if you know what it is you're adapting. And so what you want to do is you want to get rid of all the other things around it, all of the like, let's censor it, let's see it, and now see what you can do with an adaptation. And that's the way I feel about adaptations today, about comics adaptations today. Obviously, I have a number of comics, and I think that's a good top 10 that was suggested at one point of time, and I'd really like to address it, like my top 10 literary adaptations into comics. And I've talked about a number of them on this channel before, and that's an interesting list because it keeps being added to. But without giving too much of that other list away, I've talked about Santiago Garcia and David Rubin's Beowulf, which I think is a terrific adaptation. I think that Rob Davis's Don Quixote adaptation is a great adaptation. I really enjoyed the Slaughterhouse-5 adaptation, but you've got it in all kinds and from all places. There are, I think, 4 adaptations of Moby Dick I have on my shelves in comics form by various people. There is, let's see, that's Frankenstein by Junji Ito. I'm just trying to think of things that are, different from each other. But these are all comics works that want to be comics works and are using things from the original to create a comic that the creator wants to create. And that, I think, is a completely different thing than that mechanized process of saying, let's take this and let's package it in a particular way so that we can sell it to kids and parents will be happy. There's just a difference in that sort of creator-oriented approach, which is where adaptations really shine, because you get to see one creator. It's like a good cover version of a song. You get to see what one person brings to the table with what other person had already put on the table. So you already have that, to be absolutely a facsimile of it, I don't think is the point. But that's a different, that's a sort of different list. We are talking about Classics Illustrated as a company and how that company approached it. And another company that took their name for international publications that used a pretty similar approach, but had what I feel are slightly different results. Although that might just be because of the time period. Like, I'm more interested in the 70s and 80s styles, which have learned from things that have come before, than I am in the very raw 40s and 50s styles, which obviously were pioneers in the field. And so they were doing things that everyone. So I understand that. So that might be the reason for the bias. But they're very similar in many other ways. All right, let's go to the comments. Comics Dude says that he read a lot of books and never knew about illustrated comics. These were all over the place when I was young. And I think even today, you'll find a lot of graphic novels. You'll find a lot of companies that bring out classic stories, especially the out of copyright stories, because anyone can adapt them and anyone can write them. You don't have an estate or royalty things to. So very often lower price publishers who don't have the budgeting or the financial wherewithal to create brand new work with authors will sometimes have work for hire with copyright free things, because you get that brand recognition, because you get that whole idea. So I think they're quite common. I think depending on one's snobbery, like I was talking about, one might decide to stay away from it. And I have relatives who will buy comics like that for their kids, or I've known neighbors who do that, where they don't really know anything about it. They're going by, what do I think the child will like? At the same time, what am I okay with the child having? So these kind of fulfill that position. I think that sort of intersection of those two things. So Sleepy Reader says that the Classics Illustrated Ivanhoe did lead him to the original novel. So there you go. I mean, it's actually very different from person to person. I think when I ask people if they've read Gulliver's Travels, most people will say yes, because they've read either it in an abridged children's illustrated form or a comics form. And that's what I think my initial things was about. But of course, I'm a much more matured person now, and I've been led to so many things from comics as well. They were reprints because the art kind of looked like Lee Falk's art. Yes, exactly. Well, Lee Falk's art, if you thought it would look like the Phantom, then it may have been, I'll say, Rajat, it may have been the original Classics Illustrated. Again, the original is from 1940s to 1970s. So it could be 60s, it could be 70s, it could be 50s. But if you're seeing Lee Falk art, it may not be these ones from Pendulum Press. Although who knows, it might be a more modern Lee Falk that you're talking about. I have some classic illustrated reprints, says mostly retro, that are 525 and 7.5 inches and computer colored, published by Acclaim Books. Interesting. They also include quite a lot of back matter, the bio of the author and other info. Interesting. I'd be interested to know if those classics illustrated reprints that you're talking about, mostly retro, are the ones with Redondo and Nino, those artists. Are we talking about that from New Age? But no, because if it's US and it's Classics Illustrated, then it wouldn't be, because they wouldn't be Classics Illustrated in the US. They would be Classics Illustrated in other places, UK and Africa and India. Yes, I did. Thank you, Edward. I did see Comics Dude's super chat. It isn't $400 though, in case you're thinking about that. But yes, I will. I will get to Love and Rockets one day. The box set is going to have to wait for a while until I get to it. I'll have to get to it and bring it back. It's a special guest. Revanji, good to see you. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I remember reading that one. That one was great as well. Samrad, good to see you. The black and white ones I've shown were put out by Pendulum Illustrated Classics. Exactly. Pendulum Press from 73 to 78. So not as long as so it's 5 years. I don't know how many. I know that I've read at least 6, 7, 8 of the Pendulum Press. What I now know is Pendulum Press. Again, I knew them as Classics Illustrated. But I'd love to get my hands on originals or reprints, whatever's affordable and available. Yes, my library. Yes, these are just some of the shelves. There are some shelves that are outside. In case there are new to the channel viewers or people who are not aware, I do have 16 episodes of shelf tours, because a long time ago when I started the channel, people said, give us a shelf tour, give us a shelf tour. And I didn't want to do it. I wanted to talk about books in detail. And I decided that, okay, because people really wanted to see the entire thing, I decided to do one video per shelf, so I still get to talk about books. So in case you haven't seen it, there is a playlist on my channel called Our Comics Collection, and it goes shelf 1, shelf 2, shelf 3. And so it'll cover most of what I have over here, even though it's some years old. Oh, I think I've messed up the chat where I was on the chat. Everyone is biased, Comics Dude says. Absolutely. Am I familiar with Garrett Hines' work? I have Garrett Hines' Odyssey, and I have Garrett Hines' Beowulf. Those are the only 2 books of his that I've read, his adaptations. I really like them. Does he have others? Because I think I looked for other books by him, but I couldn't find them. But that was also great, because if you read his Beowulf and then the Santiago Garcia, David Rubin Beowulf, they're very different, and that's what I like. Is that if I'm adapting Beowulf, give me this, give me some very, very different versions of it by filtered through that artist. Shakespeare's plays and Beowulf, yes. Okay, Shakespeare's plays, I'd have to look at. Iliad and the Odyssey. I don't have the Iliad, I do have the Odyssey. All right, looks like I am all caught up on chat. So now that we established that all of this, money grubbing, let's get kids to take some good stories instead of crappy comics, and let's get parents to buy them stuff based on literature thing can also result in good stuff. But the kind of adaptations we're talking about, the ones that I mentioned, the ones that are being talked about over here in the chat, those sort of creator oriented vision ones aren't necessarily what we associate with Classics Illustrated. Or is it? This is the next thing in the story, is because in the 19 in the towards the end of the 80s or the beginning of the 90s, Classics Illustrated sort of, from what I can tell, again, this is where I'll rely on all of you detectives to do a better job, decided to bring back the Classics Illustrated line, but getting individual creators or creator teams, separate creator teams, people who work in comics, people who create comics, to work on these adaptations. And perhaps the most famous, the most celebrated of these is Moby Dick by Bill Sienkiewicz. I hope I pronounced that right. I know that someone had corrected me once, but I've not had much practice except for that Daredevil Electra video. But this is, what is this, like 40 pages? 48, I guess, if you're taking the signatures or something. It's 48 pages, and Moby Dick is 500 pages, 480 pages of prose, dense prose. So this is perhaps one of the slightest from the point of view of original page count. And of course, it's in comics. But this is a very famous, I think it's a very famous comic. I've heard people talk about it all the time. This is Classics Illustrated. This is a full size, it looks like a trade paperback, although the size of 1/4 of a trade paperback. So fuller size. Bill Sienkiewicz, written by Bill Sienkiewicz with, sorry, I forget, Dan Chichester, I think. I don't have my glasses, but Herman Melville's Moby Dick. And this is, well, you've got this thing of a Classics Illustrated over here saying these adaptations are not meant to be substitutes for the originals. They are a vision of the artist and hopefully should lead you to discovering those great stories in themselves in those other forms. But this is about the forms, which is good, because this seems to be a different approach, or at least it's put forward as a different approach. And then you've got Bill Sienkiewicz working on this, which is essentially the most different approach you will see coming from a company like Classics Illustrated. Now, those of you familiar with Bill Sienkiewicz's work, I'm really not. I cannot confess to be any sort of an expert. May not be surprised or blown away by this, which is fine. You can be that way. To me, it's absolutely magnificent. This, as an adaptation of Moby Dick, is one of the most lean, one of the most cutting kind of jobs, where he has focused really on a particular mood, and that is the mood that he has amplified in his approach over here. The comic is haunting, but very often I find myself stopping the reading of it to look at the page and to look at the images, and then sometimes I'll not have read things properly. It's like a strange hypnosis where the text is not bad. This is perhaps a robust adaptation of Melville's language and taking it in there. My biggest, I don't even want to call it a criticism, but there's no humor in this comic. And Moby Dick actually is a very funny book, or it has a good dollop of humor in it. That's not something that you'll find in this comic, but it doesn't really matter, because what you're looking at over here is a very singular adaptation, a very loving approach. And you can see, I think, the influence of comics that have been becoming popular. At this point of time, this Classics Illustrated is, I mean, it's not quite the Sandman. It's not quite, it's something unique, but it does have a feeling of how I'm going to tell this story is going to be laid out on the page, is going to be done with the color, is going to be done with the shape and shadow, feeling that in a different way than the more prosaic sort of illustration approaches were concerned, where I was admiring the realism of this art and the the formal integrity of something very traditional, something that I found lacking in these earlier versions, something that wasn't quite right. This, on the other hand, was quite right. It looked really good. And then when you get to this, you're not quite really sure what you're talking about anymore. Now you've gone from Melville to being Sienkiewicz. This is basically what you're reading. You're reading Sienkiewicz do a cover version of, like, make one song out of one paragraph's worth of writing. I mean, I'm exaggerating, of course, but the idea is you don't read this to try to know the story of Moby Dick. You don't read this to find out about Ahab or Queequeg or Ishmael or the relationship between the sailors or the industry or the or what these you read it to think. Well, you read it to get Bill Sienkiewicz's take on obsession and the depths and the distance that someone can sink into that obsession. And that's what this is. And that's why it being this slim is not a problem, because compared to what? You don't compare this to anything else. You take this for being what it is, why it is, and understand that in a way that every single page being an art piece is something that a lot of people say about a lot of comics. And even when I agree, I don't necessarily love that idea. I do think that comics should be page after page reading, not stopping and staring at one page or one panel as if it is a painting isolated by itself. And to be perfectly honest, sometimes that kind of art, even when it's so impressive, can interfere with it as a comics read. And sometimes, as I was saying, that does happen over here. I forget to read, or I'm reading and I'm not that interested in reading the words. I'm looking back at the picture, then I'm reading the words, and I'm a little impatient with the words because I want to get onto the next picture because I've already absorbed the full page. It's a very unusual paradox for me, is that it's so good, but is it really good as a comic? Now, I'm not saying this is not good as a comic. This is kind of mind-blowing as a comic, in my opinion. But it's a very different experience reading this than reading any of that. This is something else as far as Moby Dick is concerned. So this makes it very interesting. You're like, Classics Illustrated? Is this what you want to do? Is this what you... So you're not... This is not for kids. This is not necessarily for kids. You could have a kid read it. There's nothing adult in it from the point of view of violence, or except for violence against whales, sex, etc. This is not, but it's not for kids. It's for anyone. But yet you still have a note that says this shouldn't be a substitute to reading the real Moby Dick. Go out and read the real Moby Dick. So is this for adults to go out and read Moby Dick? I think that's just something they put in the cover so that you don't get accused of trying to make something boiled down and bite-sized and Cliff's Notes. You don't get the criticism, or you try to deflect the criticism that you're watering down literature to make it pop art or what have you. The idea is this is a separate item. I don't think it needs that little thing at the beginning, but they have it over there, and it's a superb item. It's a great adaptation because it's so singular and so idiosyncratic. It's so much its creator's work, the creator of this comic, that Melville and Moby Dick is secondary. And that's, I think, an interesting thing. I really think more and more when I think about adaptations, I really think I don't want to think about it in comparison to the original. I want to think about it as a work by this artist because I have the original. I know what the original is. I can always go back and visit that original. What I want to see is what someone's done with it. And so therefore, my favorite character doesn't appear, etc., stuff is secondary. That might be one of the things you say the reason is why you didn't enjoy something, but I don't know, maybe that's more complicated or more roundabout a thing. But for me, this adaptation from Classics Illustrated made me think, well, what else do they have? And then I realized that I have some sort of an idea because I had heard something about this. As I said, Bill Sienkiewicz's Moby Dick is probably the most famous and it's the most talked about. But there was something in my brain that I was like, no, 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 no. I know something about Classics Illustrated. I know something about, and then I know something about Rick Geary, because Rick Geary is one of my favorite comics writer artists, and he's vastly underrated. I've tried to make a couple of videos on Rick Geary. Nobody watched them. It doesn't matter. I love Rick Geary. I love his comics. He keeps making comics, and he's still making comics. And I knew that he had a couple of adaptations for Classics Illustrated. And I realized that, of course, since I'm talking about Rick Geary, I won't be talking about the 1970s or the 80s ones with the artists as part of the Filipino invasion. It must be the early 90s ones. And that's when my research took me into what else had Classics Illustrated done at this time when they did this. Now, weirdly, I couldn't find anything else from Classics Illustrated. Or if I did find something, it was at a ridiculous price. There was no cover image. It was almost as if it was a phantom line of comics. And I was like, that can't be. You're talking about a famous comic. You're talking about a famous creator. So there must be other famous creators. The assumption was, because that's the thing that they say in the back of it, and they even list some. They don't say who the adapters are. They just give you the author's names, like Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. I didn't know that. I want to know who's doing Through the Looking Glass. But they do say that these epic stories are going to be adapted by comics artists. So I was like, where are all these comics? And I couldn't find them. Maybe some of you have them, because I haven't, at least sitting in India, been able to find anything outside of this from this Classics Illustrated line at this time. However, there is a however. Yes, I am growling because of low views. Not because of low views, but because it's Rick Geary. And of course, anyway, I'm not going to get into that. Gore Vidal, good to see you here. Jesse Lynch, good to see you here. I will say now, the however is because I could not find any Classics Illustrated from this time, but I learned that Paper Cuts, the American company that publishes for children and publishes comics, Paper Cuts had reprinted these Classics Illustrated stories, and they'd reprinted them in smaller versions. And I'm like, well, Paper Cuts is still around, and people who have been on other views, on other videos on mine, I've talked about Paper Cuts comics. I've talked about them positively when I've talked about the Smurfs editions that they brought out. I've talked about them less than positively when I talked about the Asterix editions that they brought out. But I did realize that Paper Cuts is a company that licenses things, that takes permissions and gets properties that have been published by others, because Asterix and Smurf. So they do these European comics, but they also do it for American comics, because they reprinted these classics, these illustrated classics. And that's when I found all of these, because this is still not the entire Classics Illustrated library, but they were hardcovers brought out by Paper Cuts that reprinted the Classics Illustrated. And let me see if I can, and they kept the Classics Illustrated logo, but you can see Paper Cuts here on the spine, and then they had a number. So these hardcovers are reprints of these books, so they are a little smaller, although to be fair, since this Moby Dick is the only one I've seen of Classics Illustrated, I'm not sure if all of them were this size, but all of the Paper Cuts books are this size. And I believe that these books are available in hardcover as well as in paperback in this form, in this edition. So now that I knew where to look, I should be looking for Classics Illustrated originals. I should be looking for the Paper Cuts reprints. I started my hunt with a renewed fervor to find, let me see, which was the first one that I found. Well, obviously, because I was looking, I found Great Expectations, written and drawn by Mr. Rick Geary. I was very happy to find this. This is this is a great book, but once again, I have the Charles Dickens book. I've read the Charles Dickens book. This is a Rick Geary comic. That's what I'm here for. I'm here for his art. I'm here for his lettering. I'm here for his dry writing and taking this story of economic, well, how would you put it? It's not quite a satire, but it's a question of wealth, and it's a question of our expectations from wealth. Taking that, his dry approach, if you've never read any of Rick Geary's comics, he's sort of specialized in 20th century and Victorian era true murder stories, true crime stories. He has National Lampoon comics, he has stuff from before as well, but these days, and some of the stories that he's written have to do with Billy the Kid, but they do have violence in them. They do have murder in them. And his fascination with that true crime presentation, it's usually black and white comics though. And so this is an additional bonus for me, is getting this gorgeous art, this gorgeous lettering, this gorgeous layouts, and this wonderful writing, this whimsical, light touch, even with the most serious of matters. His take on Charles Dickens's Great Expectations. And I'd be fine if someone said, this is not what I expect Great Expectations. Sorry, yes. This is not what I expect Great Expectations to look like. Yeah, well, this is what I expect Rick Geary to look like. His drawings can be rounder and they can be a little longer, but they're all essentially in this style that he has made his own since the National Lampoon days. And this was a fantastic adaptation. Of course, I'm biased. I will say it's fantastic because it's Rick Geary, but this is, once again, it's like his true fiction. It's played straight, it's played uncomplicated. This is not an expressionistic interpretation the way that Bill Sienkiewicz's is, but this is, to me, a great comic because I'm very clear about what's going on. I'm reading this, and at the same time, it is done by a comics master. It's someone who understands comic storytelling, their selection of dialogue, their selection of scenes, their use of color and shape and layout, and where the speech, text, panels intersect with the art, and is all accomplished, and you feel like you're in great hands. And I felt between this and this that this was a series of books worth taking a look at. I can see that there are already some comments coming in about these others. I'm quickly going to get to the next book that I got, which was another Rick Geary book, which is The Invisible Man. And I found that Rick Geary had actually done 3 of these classics illustrated, The Invisible Man and Wuthering Heights. If anything, The Invisible Man is even better than Great Expectations. I think this is my favorite Rick Geary adaptation of these 3. It's wonderfully done, and once again, not necessarily what you might be thinking of as far as The Invisible Man is concerned, especially if you've seen where Alan Moore decided to take The Invisible Man. So again, depending on your attachment to the H.G. Wells's original or any other form of Invisible Man that you've seen, this is Rick Geary's take on it. Again, a faithful adaptation as far as the story is concerned, but wonderfully executed with impeccable sense of what to include and what not to include to make this particular story have a velocity and a driving force. It doesn't feel scattered. It doesn't feel like here are a number of different things that have to be included in it because they were in the original story. There are no loose threads. Things are clear all throughout, and I'm a big fan of clarity in comics, especially the ones that are doing a job in adapting. Even if you want to take a bold approach, it should be clear where that's going, and this, I think, does a terrific job of that. And the same for Wuthering Heights. So again, wonderful color schemes, and what can I say? If you haven't read Rick Geary comics, these are good ones to start with, because you know to a certain extent that the plot is going to be something you like or enjoy. And I think if you give these a chance, you might find yourself disarmed by an extremely charming writer artist. So, in order to round out my Rick Geary collection, I now had three more classics, classics illustrated in their paper cuts reprints. And then I found, as I think someone has already mentioned in the comments, Through the Looking Glass. And since I had asked that question, who did through, because of the back of the Bill Sienkiewicz book, it's Kyle Baker. Kyle Baker of Plastic Man fame, as well as Nat Turner. I've talked about both of those books in separate videos, very different books from each other. And this is a third Kyle Baker giving you a different glimpse into this popular story. You can see that the format that he's using is reminiscent of old comics with the text under the image, but he's also using these longer panels and these shapes that even over here, I think, conjure up Winsor McCay and Nemo. And Kyle Baker's take on this, keeping it in these narrow strips, making it claustrophobic and having that sort of narrative press against it, allows for bigger panels to sort of explode outward with surprise. This is a very bold, interesting, and extremely entertaining take on this. On this book, and this book that sometimes is not as read as Alice in Wonderland, or is just put together as one book. This is specifically the Looking Glass story, which is even trippier, I guess you could say, than and the surrealism of it and the dissonance of it, I think, is very well captured in this comic adaptation. So Kyle Baker joins Bill Sienkiewicz and Rick Geary as authors of illustrated classics. I'm going to try to get these out of the way before they tumble. They've kind of got a big, dangerous stack over here. Couple of the other books. Here you have The Devil's Dictionary by Ambrose Bierce. This is Gahan Wilson adapting The Devil's Dictionary. How do you adapt the dictionary? It's pretty simple. You've got the text and the illustrations. So it's an illustrated dictionary of Ambrose Bierce's work. If you're a fan of Gahan Wilson, I've only read 2 small comics by him, but I really like his cartooning style. This may not, to many people, feel like a comic, but this is, again, it's a job of adaptation, because what is being adapted is a dictionary, and that is going to have certain selections made, but you're not really going to be able to mess with the format of a dictionary anymore, is what you would think. But no, you do have comics. And then the references can go between that. These pages. And I think because it's white, this is getting a little bit more blown out than I would like. Let me see if this is any better to admire the art. Ambrose Bierce's Devil's Dictionary and Other Works, adapted by Gahan Wilson. So a couple of short ones in there as well. Then we have, I think also mentioned in the chat, The Scarlet Letter by P. Craig Russell and Jill Thompson. So what a combo. You've got Nathaniel Hawthorne, P. Craig Russell, and Jill Thompson. Jill Thompson, the artist of many things. She's got the Sandman stories that she's famous for. I'm obviously a big fan of her Beasts of Burden artwork. And here you see that same painted approach. I think these pages are just to Maybe my exposure is set for yellowed paper. Maybe this will be better. Yes, Ashwata says the Wuthering Height, the Wuthering Heights looks good. You should take a look at that, Ashwata. Rick Geary, I've been telling you to check him out. But this is P. Craig Russell, Jill Thompson. Very nice color scheme. Nothing very bold because obviously it's the scarlet that will stand out, but not in a dripping blood sort of way. Very handsome adaptation. Great for fans of either creator, but both of them working together. I think just worth a look from that point of view. But again, a nice, handsome adaptation. Nothing too experimental, but what you're getting over here is the style of these creators and what they're bringing to this story. Now, I have a bunch of other books here, but I will confess that many of the people who are named over here and who worked on these books are not necessarily people I'm familiar with. But from what I understand, they were artists and writers not just in the United States, but also from Europe and Asia. So this is something I think that opens things up, because if I think that you've got Bill Sienkiewicz and Gahan Wilson and Jill Thompson and P. Craig Russell and Rick Geary, the other books should also be worth it, because these books were worth it. And that's why I picked up. And here you can take a look and see if you recognize. This is, Michel Plessy adapting The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. The Wind in the Willows. The Wind in the Willows is one of my favorite books. And I was going to say favorite children's books, but who am I kidding? It's one of my favorite books. And I think it's widely recognized as being one of the first anthropomorphic animal fiction. And this is probably one of those sources of my love of animal stories, whether they are anthropomorphized or not. And this artwork is just delicious. It's beautiful. Now, The Wind in the Willows is a particular favorite story of mine for its prose. I think that the writing in it is quite lovely. And what I was happy to see in this is that quite a lot of that has been retained. There are a couple of key moments and scenes that I would have been unhappy to see edited differently. But this is, of course, me being the complete opposite of what I said I was going to be. I said I was going to judge these works as adaptations and their works by these creators, and instantly I'm making comparisons to the original, which I think is natural in some ways, but in particular for The Wind in the Willows, just because I'm so big a fan of this work and I know it so well, I think it's a little harder for me to distance myself from that. Although I will say that David Peterson of Mouse Guard has an illustrated edition of Wind in the Willows. And it's just lovely. It's the prose, but it's illustrations by David Peterson. And when you see that book, half of me wants to have David Peterson adapt the whole book into a comic, and half of me just wants it in that illustrated form. So because the prose and that illustrated version edition works so well, because that edition particularly works so well, I feel that The Wind in the Willows might not be one that I judge very fairly. But when I look at this book, I think, all right, this can change my mind. There is a little bit of a Disney approach to the cartooning over here. I think that's absolutely acceptable or understandable in The Wind in the Willows. If it was Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of the NIMH, the Nim story, or if it was A Mouse and His Boy by Russell Hoban, ones that have slightly more darkness in them, I think it may not have worked. But I think it works really well for this story, which really is more of a light, summary type of story anyway. Jesse Lynch says that I marched in our annual winter as one of the characters in The Wind in the Willows, one of the opossum. Oh, you haven't read it? That's interesting. Yes, you should read The Wind in the Willows. You could start with this or that illustrated by David Peterson version. But that's The Wind in the Willows, adapted by Michel Plessy, Plessix. I am not familiar with this creator. Then there are. Oh, so here's The Call of the Wild by Jack London, adapted by Charles Dixon and Ricardo Villagran. So Charles Dixon over here, I believe, is Chuck Dixon. Now, I haven't read a lot of Chuck Dixon. I know that Chuck Dixon has a lot of superhero comics and even non-superhero comics, but I believe this is Chuck Dixon writing. And Ricardo Villagran or Viagran, I'm not familiar with that name if anyone knows. But this I found to be another one of those handsome but maybe a little bit more straightforward adaptations. I think it's well written. Once again, what it selects of Jack London's work, the manner in which it puts that, the brutality of the world across, I think was pretty effective. But this did seem to me to be more like an illustrated book, even though it's very obviously done in comics panels. And I think that's one of the things that I've found with many of these adaptations is the ones that do not have speech bubbles, and particularly with The Call of the Wild, it is a little difficult to have speech bubbles, but the ones that rely almost purely on narration, and this includes the Bill Sienkiewicz Moby Dick, that's where it feels a little more distanced for me, because then I have to read these blocks of text and they have to lead into one another, and they're sort of linked to one another in a way that comics text is usually much more flowing. And when it's only that captions, when it's only those boxes and box text, that really starts wearing on me after a while. It becomes very obvious to me that a large block of prose has been fragmented in order to insert these illustrations, and these illustrations often become purely illustrating what the writing is saying. Unlike, say, something like Watchmen, where the writing and the image might be at contrast or creating a third impression. And this, I think, is the most straightforward. Although many of these, even the Rick Geary ones, especially the Rick Geary ones, might be seen as straightforward adaptations, but they have a tone in them that I feel is the creator, the comics creator, bringing their voice to whatever the original prose author had done. The Call of the Wild is not quite there. It's not quite at that level for me, although, again, a perfectly enjoyable, handsome adaptation. And then I have 4 books over here, the 4 other Classics Illustrated hardcovers that I was able to find. And these are called Classics Illustrated Deluxe. Oh, actually, so was The Wind in the Willows. So if you look at this, which on this side, it says Classics Illustrated Deluxe, and not all of them say deluxe. So the deluxe ones, I think, that the thing that makes them deluxe is they're fatter. They're bigger books. So they have more pages, and I'm guessing that they had a higher price because of that. But as far as I can tell, that's really the only difference, is that the deluxe editions are a little stouter, a few more pages than that. So The Wind in the Willows was the first one that I saw, that deluxe thing over there. And then the 4 others that I have are Tales from the Brothers Grimm, adapted by Mazin, Cécile Chicot, and Philippe Petit. European comics creators, I once again have not heard of any of them or read anything by them. If you have, do let me know what I could check out by them, because This is a collection of stories, obviously the Brothers Grimm stories, and I thought these were fantastic. This does not have that straightforwardness approach. There's plenty of speech bubbles, there's plenty of conversation, but it moves along and it has a real sense of place and gloom and adventure, the things that the Grimm's fairy tales are famous for, in, I must say, in their children's versions. This is not some original violence, although it can be dark. It is definitely for children, but the art and the writing over here in this story, I think, work really well together. I believe that the different stories have different artists. And so, therefore, the four Grimm's fairy tales you see over here, two of them I think are by the same artist, and the third and the fourth are by different artists. And they're all written, if I'm remembering correctly, by the same person. But you get a nice variation in style according to for the story that you're reading. So this does say number 2, so I'm guessing that the deluxe editions, maybe, yeah, I think the deluxe editions may be numbered separately or not. Some of them have hashtags, some of them don't. It's really very. I should probably look closer into these things, because even the logos, let's say of the Brothers Grimm, the stories of the Brothers Grimm, that logo over there is very different from the logo over here. Another deluxe edition, the Monkey God, telling the Chinese legend story. Let me see. This is adapted by. Let me see if I can find a better page. Well, of course, I can't find my glasses now, but this adaptation was something that I was really interested in, because the Monkey God legend is a legend that I've enjoyed. I've watched a couple of TV shows. I think I've watched an anime from a very long time ago. And there's obviously the Monkey God story plays a big part in a couple of very famous big comics, especially American Born Chinese by Jean Luen Yang. This is yet another retelling. I will have to say that the Monkey God legend, every single adaptation or version that I've read of it, has been very different. There are certain things that are in common, but they're always presented in such a different way, particularly in American Born Chinese, because of its connection with the rest of the story, that reading it in this form was like reading a new story. It's as if it's a cover of a cover in some ways, just because I have read stories, because this is about a journey. It's a journey to the West, a journey to India. But the Monkey God's intersection with the journey to the West is only for one part. So there is a Monkey God story before the journey to the West and one after it as well. So which part of that story of the Monkey God you're reading makes a big difference to the tone and to the stories that you're getting. This is a digest version of most of the stories that I've read before. At the same time, it does slow down for action scenes and things that are much more mystical and discussion oriented. So timing and pacing of this comic is very interesting, and one of the more, I think, one of the bolder Classics Illustrated. I'm not counting this, this is out of out of competition. This is something else altogether. But of the other ones that we've seen, this one is probably a little bit more experimental and quite enjoyable. So this is something that I would recommend as an adaptation and a good way to get into this legend. Although, as I said, every version you read of it will be will have something different. And these creators, the European and the Asian creators over here. Sorry, did I say who the Monkey God was by? No, because I didn't. Oh, hold on. I found my glasses. All right, this is Jian Yi, Legal, and Morvan. So if I'm not sure if you can read that down there, or I'll put that up here in case you're interested. But yeah, the paper cuts hardcover deluxe of the Monkey God. which leaves me with just two more deluxes. This is Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, getting the deluxe treatment at this is probably the biggest one I have. Well, there's the stories of the Brothers Grimm. I think this might be even bigger than that. So Oliver Twist gets quite a heavy adaptation, and the Murders in the Rue Morgue by Edgar Allan Poe also gets a pretty robust adaptation because this is a short story, and so that's quite a good amount of effort as far as pages are concerned to be put in on that short story. Both of these I think are worthwhile. Oliver Twist to me was maybe the more interesting one, although it's hard to choose. It's not a competition. Oliver Twist was a handsome comic. You, from the very beginning, you know you're in very good hands. Actually, that's true for all of these, but this felt like it isn't dark the way that it is reminiscent a little bit, I think, in the art style of the Loisel Peter Pan, although it'll be different, but it is obviously not as dark as that gets. The cartooniness is more amped up, but it's lovely. It's almost animated in front of your eyes the way that this comic moves, and I like the fact that it takes its time, because this adaptation really spends time with different people that Oliver encounters and gives them scenes and moments that make him being an orphan or him wanting a family, makes that poignant, which is quite an important part to have. So if you skip too fast, you don't get those connections, and you think about it only as he's poor and he needs to be rich, whereas actually he's alone and he needs a family, is the way that you should be leaning, and that's the way this story made me lean. So I think this is a really good adaptation of Oliver Twist. Let me see if I can read who these creators are. Adapted by D'Auvilliers, Deloy, Merlet, and Rouget. So salvage, it says. So I guess this is an ex-library copy that I was able to pick up. Yes, property of the U.S. Army, Grant Library, 167 Flint Street, Fort Carson, Colorado. All right, so that's where this book is from. I really always like reading which libraries my used copies have come from. And then adapted by Morvan. So we've got Morvan on a couple of these books now that I've noticed. So there's Morvan doing the Murders of the Rue Morgue, as well as Tales from the Brothers. No, wait, that was something else. The Monkey King, was it? Yes, adapted by Morvan. So the Monkey God, sorry, not the Monkey King, the Monkey God, and Murders of the Rue Morgue, adapted by the same writer. Artist over here. And other tales, sorry, there's a different team for the other tales. So Morvan is with Drouet, and I'm just making a complete mess of all of these names. Corberam and Marcel. Again, you may know. Oh, there we go. That's the full name. Jean David Morvan. I'm just assuming that's a French name. I could be wrong. And Fabrice Drouet and Paul Marcel. Those are the two teams behind the Arthur Conan Doyle stories. Very different art style, very different coloring approach from the ones that we've seen before. This feels the most classic in some ways, the most classics illustrated, but obviously a modern, not just with the line work being better and the shading and the coloring, but I wouldn't call this a straightforward adaptation. Again, most of the plot adaptation part of it is pretty straightforward, but it is a very tightly told story. And the Murders of the Rue Morgue obviously has been done so many times before, and even in comics, I think I've looked at a couple. Did I look at the Culbard comics? Anyway, yes. So since we've seen them in a number of ways, I find it interesting to see what the differences are between versions. But when reading this, I did get the distinct, once again, the thing I'm looking for, a distinct comics voice, different from the things that I'd read before, which is really what the whole point of that adaptation is. And I found that to be quite rewarded. So, all in all, I think this is a great collection of comics put together by Classics Illustrated. This 90s, early 90s run by people like Rick Geary and Kyle Baker and these other creators from Europe whom I've not heard of, but whose work over here makes me want to seek out more of their work. So, in some ways, the Classics Illustrated are now doing the thing that they said they were doing, is that when you read this, you're going to go away and you're going to read the real literature. And that's not the point. I'm not going to go away and read Murders in the Rue Morgue again, mainly because I've read it before, but I'm going to go read what these writers and artists have done. At least that's the way it would be for the ones that really appeal to you. So I think there's something quite interesting in seeing how different people adapt things. And the more I look at adaptations, the more I become interested in that. Now, the only thing is, can you enjoy an adaptation? Can you enjoy an adaptation without having read the original work? I think the answer to that obviously is yes. But can you judge it as how good an adaptation it is? It becomes a little confusing. It's like, if I don't know what it's adapting from, or if I don't know what it's doing to change, how do I know whether it's a good adaptation or not? And that question keeps going round and round, because the answer is, I think the answer is, if it's good and it's an adaptation, then it's a good adaptation. And I know that that's not what people mean. They're like, has it been adapted well? And I don't really know what that means anymore, of has it been adapted well. You might think that's a clever thing to do. Oh, you made the witches into pot smoking, college kids, whatever. That kind of adaptation is a different thing. But if it is a good movie, if it is a good comic, if it is a good thing in that new medium that it's been adapted to, that means it's a good adaptation. Is The Godfather a good adaptation of the novel? Does not make sense if you've already accepted that The Godfather is an excellent movie. Now, the fact that it is an adaptation means that it's a good adaptation. That's where I've come to today. So when I look at these books, I say, did I have a good time reading these comics? Did they make me excited? Did they make me interested? There is this idea that either you know the plot or you don't know the plot, and that might be one thing, but that's not really about adaptation. That's about your knowledge. It's about you knowing it. You could know that from spoilers. What I find to be very interesting is finding this new thing where I'm not like as a child reading comics to find out what the story of Moby Dick is or what the story of The Last of the Mohicans is. Now I'm reading comics to see, what do these writers and artists have to tell me about that piece of literature? How did they react to it? The way I would have reacted to it in a different way. They're artists, they're writers. Their reaction is what I am interested in. And that's where I think I'm going to end today's live stream. We've gone through a bunch of different comics. I know it was a little haphazard, but I really found it interesting to excavate the history of Pendulum Press and to find out what I was thinking about as Classics Illustrated weren't actually Classics Illustrated. And the same things, the reasons I objected to this idea of the Classics Illustrated and what I actually enjoyed ended up being a thing that Classics Illustrated themselves did. And I think that's a great thing to do. I mean, I would love to see other companies do such things. And I'm thinking over here, particularly in places like India, where you may have established publishers who deal with folk tales and historical tales and tales of mythology, things that are classics in some way or the other. And they've got a very straightforward approach to telling those stories, because they take that remedial approach, like, here's a spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down. Here's how you educate your children. Here's how you get them to learn about real reading. Here's how you... Instead, if they were interested in having a unique artistic interpretation where you hire particular writers and artists who are good at storytelling and ask them to give their interpretation of this classic story that we've heard 100 times before, but put their spin on it, I think it's a wonderful thing. I'm not quite sure if anybody outside of Sienkiewicz is actually putting that much of a spin on it. I think even over there, the text part of it isn't that interesting, but the text part of it isn't that interesting in these either. The art is what's interesting. Whereas when I look at the Rick Geary adaptation, is it his own spin? It's like, if you look at those illustrations, if you look at those characters, if you look at the way the buildings look, there's no doubt it's his own spin on Wuthering Heights or Great Expectations. That's really what I want to see. I want to see writers and artists given out of copyright things, and not to make grim and gritty, and not to, like, reboot it in a cyberpunk world and stuff like that, but just to adapt it by using what they get as an essence of the story and play it straight to a certain extent and add their touch to a certain extent. I love to see that. And then I think whenever I make that video on adaptations, whenever I make that video on looking at those, my favorite adaptations, maybe that'll be a place to talk about it in a bit more detail of why do these adaptations work, even if they're not grim and gritty reboots, even if they're not putting something on the moon. How can they be straight and so unique at the same time? That's obviously what I enjoy. That's obviously what Classics Illustrated has done to varying degrees in the 90s. It's too bad about paper cuts. I hope that these books are easier to find, and I hope that I'm able to get my hands on them. I hope I'm able to get my hands on more of these Pendulum Press books if possible. But yeah, that's to be seen. So that was my little zigzag journey through Classics Illustrated and the few that I've been able to put my hands on and what I've been able to piece together about this. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope you had fun. I'd love to have your comments below. Let me know if you know about these artists, these writers, if you find links to where I can get some of these comics to fill out my collection. Let me have all of that below. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. It is now 1:07 a.m. So I'm just 7 minutes over the time that I had set for myself, which I think is not too bad, all things considered. And I'll see you at the next video. Have a very good night. Bye.